Do you remember this scene in Game of Thrones? We have a whole bunch of characters fighting off an army of the undead, but what's this that they're using here? This is dragon glass, or as it's more commonly known, obsidian. I wanted to put this material to the test to see how good of a weapon it can truly be. So let's get started. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Screen Tested. Today we're taking a look at a very interesting material, that being obsidian. Now this is a material that I have never tested before, so I am actually really excited to see what it's capable of. Now obviously we are a fantasy slash pop culture channel, right? So obviously we need to dovetail it into something, and that is obviously Game of Thrones. They use a bunch of dragon glass slash obsidian weapons against the undead, the White Walkers and the Whites. I have a couple of problems with this. I mean, a lot of people have a lot of problems with Game of Thrones, especially the last couple of seasons, and I'm sure this isn't one of them. But for me, I always found it fascinating because they essentially just, got their dragon glass, their obsidian, turned it into, daggers, swords, or axes, or whatever it was, right? And essentially just used them like steel weapons. And the problem is, obsidian is rather brittle, at least from what I've seen. Like I said, I haven't tested it, so we're going to have to confirm this. How you actually make, this into like an arrowhead or a knife is you essentially get a deer antler and then you will lightly nap this material, essentially striking it precisely in different areas to induce, cracks and fractures in the places that you want to shape it into, whatever your weapon of choice is. But essentially what that means is that if you just hit this in a certain way, it will either, shatter or break or chip or whatever, right? So it is not necessarily a very robust material. And this is interesting because obviously when we see it being used in something like Game of Thrones, they're just using it like regular steel weapons, which I just don't think is plausible. I think it would just break. But I could be completely wrong, and we're not going to know for sure until we put it to the test. So with that being said, let's get started with today's episode. So getting started with the obsidian, or our dragon glass, right? Essentially what I think will be the best thing to make is a couple of arrows and some sort of knife. That will give us, I would say, a good kind of spread for testing this particular, substance, this medium, right? Now when it came to creating the arrows, I am not creating anything historical, anything ancient. I am just trying to create something that will be somewhat functional and give us proper results. So I'm just using some of my regular arrows. I cut a little slot down the head of it so that I could hopefully fit in the obsidian. I then brought it over, used a whole bunch of epoxy. Like I said, modern epoxy. I'm not using anything historical. We're trying to just test the obsidian itself, and use some nylon cord as kind of my wrap to really secure it in there. I don't know how these are going to go, but I hope they're strong enough for our, the testing purposes that we have in store for it. Then when it came for the knife, I had this larger arrowhead, and I decided, well, I should probably, create a handle for it. Usually they're going to, make it like antler or something like that. I don't have any of that. So I decided to 3D print this, essentially Voldemort's wand handle. It looks like a bone, right? I essentially just printed that out, created a channel for where the obsidian can sit in, again epoxied it in, and then used a bunch of that very strong nylon thread to hold it all together, and hopefully that's strong enough for when we actually get into the testing. So with that being said, rather simple, right? Again, we just want to see how the obsidian itself performs. So with that out of the way, let's get out there and put it to the test. Here is our dragon glass slash obsidian blades and arrows and the kind of little bit of assortment that I've created for today's episode. Now I want to make this clear right off the outset because this thing is awesome, right? This thing is really cool. It is the biggest piece that I've got, but I'm not necessarily going to be testing this particular one just because this is actually what I'm going to keep in my collection as my kind of reference going forward for obsidian. So I've got a smaller version, and obviously we have a whole bunch of different arrows and arrowheads. I do have one stone arrowhead that I am actually really interested to see how that performs, obviously as kind of a comparison. But generally speaking, we have our obsidian arrows, our obsidian daggers slash blades. So what I wanted to test against was a harder target, that being Tony, to see how it holds up. I want to test it against something more of a flesh analog, that being a ballistic head. And then last but not least, I want to test it against some other targets like regular regular cutting mediums to see how it compares to obviously regular blades that we cut with. Now, I have a couple of, I would say, assumptions going into this, but again, never really tested this before, so I could be proven completely wrong, and that would be a welcome surprise, honestly. I think it's going to perform pretty shit, if you want to, like, my honest opinion here. I think when we hit something hard like Tony, not only do I think that the Obsidian is going to completely break and dislodge from the arrow shafts themselves, but I also think the material is probably going to crack and or shatter. If you actually look at how Obsidian is made, you know, with knapping, it's really not that difficult in terms of like the pressures that you have to apply to, you know, chip bits off and break it off. Yes, it will probably be lethal, right? We will be able to put an arrow through the ballistic head. We will be able to, I would say, have lethal output, but not necessarily, I would say, longevity with our weapons. For example, the weapons will probably break. Real Dark Souls 1 type shit, right? Weapons breaking all the time, but at the same time, they will still have lethality about them, right? I feel like this is an important kind of contrast, because a lot of people will be like, well, yeah, it's still going to kill you. That's 100% true. I'm going into this with a couple of assumptions, hoping to be proven wrong and hoping to, you know, learn something, obviously, because I like it when we explore these new material type things. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to stab a bottle with this big knife. I'm only going to use it once, so you better enjoy it, because that's all I'm going to use this for. So because it has quite an aggressive, sharp point right at the very tip, it means that it is able to penetrate through things. Now this one here, I would say, because this is such a large piece, right? This is my biggest piece of Obsidian that I have. It doesn't have the best bevels behind it, but I'm okay with that because it means that it has a lot more strength rather than something a lot thinner. The thinner it is, the sharper it is, but also the more brittle it is. This one, a little bit thicker. I'm happy with this trade-off, specifically in kind of, you know, I mean, I would call this one a dagger. Yeah, the dagger configuration. So again, because we have that nice, beautiful, sharp tip, it can penetrate this particular medium pretty good, which I'm happy about. All right, so we're talking about Obsidian. Let's talk about the whole spurring of this particular conversation, that being dragon glass, obviously, because this is more of a Game of Thrones type tie-in. I find this interesting because obviously we still need to do some more testing, and like I said, I think we're going to have, it's not going to be the best in a lot of ways. I find it interesting because how does the dragon glass actually kill the white walkers? This is my particular question that I have, because does it actually kill them when it touches them, like a magic wand, right? Like you have your dragon glass, your Obsidian, right? And in the moment you touch a walker, that like undoes the magic and they die? Or do you actually need to make contact and open up their flesh? The reason why this is important is because obviously in the terrible seasons of Game of Thrones, we see them fighting the White Walkers with these dragon glass weapons, and they're using them essentially as regular steel weapons, which is bullshit, right? So how the hell can it get through even the terrible, like, I would say, soft hide armor that we see that all the whites kind of wearing, you know, all the rags and stuff like that. So unless you're hitting exposed areas, how exactly is the dragon glass in Game of Thrones actually killing the whites? I am very confused about this, and I don't have an answer for you. I actually, if you guys have an answer, please let me know. I want to know. There's no answer. Obviously, I could ramble a little bit more about some, you know, Game of Thrones stuff, but I think I'll save the rambling specifically for that towards the end, because then I'll have more of a larger picture in terms of how it actually holds up against different mediums. So I think the next thing that we should fire at is Tony. Let's try and put an Obsidian arrow through his very low-grade armor. Oh, I'm just practicing my berserk poses, don't mind me. I mean, while you're here, you can consider subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. This is a 50-pound bow. I think that that is completely fair for this material type. Obviously, I'm not going to be having like 100 pounds and up for this sort of material. I just don't think it would be able to handle that in the slide. I think it would shatter essentially. So I think 50 pounds being in the hunting range, you know, what is it? I think it's like 45 to 60 pounds is, you know, a good kind of area for hunting purposes. And I think for this particular material type, that is acceptable. So 50-pound bow, obsidian tipped arrows against Tony. Let's see what happens. I've only got 3 shots, so hopefully they don't break. Huh. I was so excited for a second there. The next thing is, let's see if I can pull it out. Slowly, just the tip's in there. Phrasing. The tip is firmly lodged in there, but give it a good old pull. That tip has shattered, which means somewhere inside of Tony is a sharp bit of obsidian. And that was what I was kind of like, bro, just imagine you're out there hunting and you hit a deer and it shatters inside of it and then you have to eat the obsidian. Like that to me gives me goosebumps, right? So as I said, brittle material. And this was one of the, actually I'd say this is one of the medium thicknesses in terms of arrowheads. I know that's a little bit hard to see, guys, I'm sorry. But this isn't the thickest, but it's also not the thinnest. So this one, I think that is a good representative medium. All right, let's try a couple more. I do think I might have hit one of Tony's existing areas of damage. So I'll try and hit a fresh area. 1 down, 2 to go. And it tore the head out, and it actually shattered a little bit on the back side of it. Moment of truth. Okay, I think the head is still attached. Holy shit, it survived. Intact. Even the tip didn't break. We got another shot. That got through. So that was a fresh bit of gambeson, but I heard something fly over here and I don't know what it was, but something did come off. So that did cut through the gambeson. That has made its way into Tony. Ah, there we go. The entire top half of this arrowhead has shattered off. Interesting, interesting. But it is a self-sacrificing type weapon. Like it will break to get through. But it did kind of get what I would consider to be a reasonable depth. Like that would be lethal. That was still embedded in there quite a bit. And the interesting thing I would say is, even though the tip did break off, this part here that it obviously has left is still sharp. Like this is sharp bits of, you know, glass, right? It does have a point there. I could slice something with that. So, and why that matters is because getting through like a soft flesh medium, it's going to be perfectly acceptable, right? So if the sharp bit of the weapon, you know, the triangular point, the Chad triangle, is what actually makes it through the armor, but also breaks it at the same time, all of that leftover energy goes into what I would consider to be still a sharp cutting surface. Yeah, man. Okay. That's interesting. Because I just thought that we were going to shatter the tips on impact and then it wouldn't make it through. But it still did make it through. That's... yeah, dragon glass, obsidian, let's go. All right, next test, let's see how these things perform against just a block of ballistic gel. Let's see what the actual cutting flight path is like for some arrows. What's happening here? I want to know that before we move up to the ballistic head. So what I've got here is 2 of the arrows that I have created. These ones are pretty good, pretty sharp, kind of different. I'll show you them in a minute. See what this does on closer inspection. Interesting. Interesting, interesting. We'll come in from this side here. It creates a huge wound though, that's 100% for sure. So these are the two arrowheads that I'm using in particular. One is a little bit thicker and then one is quite a lot thinner. So we'll be able to see how each of them perform. I'm gonna be quite close to this. I'm not taking any chances because honestly, like, this is a small block of ballistic gel. I might as well just shoot it from point blank range. All we need is the results. And it did cut quite a big chunk out. Holy crap, and this was the thick one. This was the thick boy. Obviously this is a very, very soft medium, you know, being ballistic gel, so I wouldn't expect this to be able to break it at all, obviously. Let's try the much finer tip this time. So starting off with our Dragon Glass Obsidian. Now this is our mini one, not our big one, because like I said, I want to keep that one. This is the one that I'm okay to destroy. Let's do some thrusts, some stabs. Let's see if we can get through essentially the head, right? Obviously I've had a little bit of a catastrophic failure with the neck, so it's sitting on a stool, but it is what it is. Let's start with coming down here like this. That worked a little bit better than I thought. Like there was a lot of resistance. I felt a lot of resistance as we got to the skull, right? But overall, that still did pretty bloody good. We'll try in through the eye socket. Oh, there we go. Hit the bone and broke that tip off. Let me pick up my severed head. Oh, that's interesting. So what we've got, the obsidian embedded into the cheekbone. First shot, let's go with our small sized obsidian tip, the one that we've used for all the other testing mediums. Let me just have a quick look. I just want to see if we got all the way through. Oh, we did. Just the tip of it is hanging out, just the tip. All right, this one is our stone head. A little bit more, got through a little bit more. Yeah, let me just put your scalp back on. Both of the tips, especially this one on the obsidian, are still intact. So I see that as an absolute win. Well, I got the stone one out, that's good, but the obsidian one is still exactly where I left it, so it broke on impact. Dragon glass, what do we think? Or obsidian, right? Interesting material. In some ways it performed exactly the way that I thought it was, and in some ways it performed better than I thought it would. So let's start off with, I would say, the durability. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, depending how thick the piece is going to depend how much, structural integrity it has. Obviously the shape and geometry is going to play a big part in that. Again, we have the Chad triangles. Now, I was quite impressed that it actually was able to penetrate through the gambeson. That to me, that's actually really interesting. Now obviously it didn't survive, it broke, it shattered, but at the same time, it was enough force to get through. And remember, that was only a 50-pound bow. Now I am curious how a kind of like obsidian tipped arrow would actually fare on something like a war bow, right? I should have brought my war bow out. I found that fascinating, but then when it came to obviously softer targets like the ballistic gel and ballistic head, it obviously can get through very, very easily because it has those sharp and gnarly tips. I think what becomes more interesting to me personally is the relationship it has between obviously when it cuts and slices versus when it obviously just forces its way through with what I would consider to be, lots of little tiny serrations, right? Because obviously serrating something and, a nice clean slice are two very different types of cutting, I would say. And in the ballistic gel, you kind of could see the difference between them. Some of the arrowheads had a nice clean trail where they would cut through, and some of them kind of, I would say, ripped their way through. And that I find interesting because it means they're performing two different types of cutting tasks. One of the things that I obviously expected and really I don't like that much is obviously when the obsidian itself kind of shatters and breaks off in the testing medium. Now let's talk about that through the context of obviously dragon glass and what we see, because this is where I find it to be kind of outside the realms of realism. Like, for example, the ballistic skull. This is a good example. When I stabbed that dagger into the cheekbone, it broke the tip off. And that was after maybe like 1 or 2 strikes. Now, again, contrast this to what you see in something like, you know, the Game of Thrones TV show, where they are using the dragon glass, the obsidian, literally just the same as they would with steel against an entire army of White Walkers. Like, it's just not really how this material type can, you know, kind of withstand a lot of those kind of impacts, especially against armored types of enemies. Now, again, I know that the White Walkers obviously have, you know, sparse amounts of armor, but it still is some sort of protective layer on top of their undead flesh or whatever it is, right? Then we get into the interesting dynamic that, you know, obviously the White Walkers themselves, not the Whites, the White Walkers are like ice, right? Or at least when they die, they explode into ice or whatever, right? Who knows with the consistency of this? How would obsidian go against something like ice? Well, ice is a very punishing medium when it comes to just regular blades. So ice against something like this, because remember, it's a very hard kind of surface. It means that when you go with obsidian versus ice, I reckon you are going to be breaking that obsidian probably like 50-50. Especially from what we've seen in the testing today, I would not be surprised if, you know, you're essentially just breaking obsidian left, right, and center when you hit something that is ice-like, for example, a White Walker. So that is the context through the lens of Game of Thrones. A little bit of context and caveats in there. As is usual with this channel, caveats and back on the menu, boys. Anyway, all right, that is going to be all. Thank you guys for watching. I don't necessarily think our dragon glass gets a tits rating, simply because it is also, it's like a real material, right? It's a real material. It's also historical at the same time, so it's not necessarily 100% in the realms of fantasy, so I just don't think it's fair. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to support the channel, there'll be links down below. I truly appreciate it. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already and you want to see more content like this. And as always, I'll see you next week in another episode. Have a good one. This was fun. I enjoy, you know, exploring these newer these materials that I haven't tested before, right? And this is definitely something that I have not tested before.